fact, it's only possible because our fallen heroes have paid its high price. A price paid which enables us to have ceremonies and observances like this in towns and cities across this great nation. The first Memorial Day was not called Memorial Day. It's believed to have been celebrated with a parade of freed slaves and Union soldiers marching through Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. Waterloo, New York is considered the official birthplace of Memorial Day because after it was observed there on May 5th, 1866, General John Murray and General John Logan called on all communities to honor the war dead every year. Logan had been impressed with how the South had honored the fallen Confederate soldiers for years. In 1868, Logan, the head of the prominent veterans group, the Grand Army of the Republic, issued a proclamation that Decoration Day be observed nationwide. The date chosen was May 30th, specifically because it was not on the anniversary of a battle. Still, many Southern communities did not want to honor Decoration Day because of lingering resentments from the Civil War. The alternate name Memorial Day wasn't commonly used until World War II, and federal law recognized the holiday as Memorial Day in 1967. As the unofficial beginning of summer, let us never lose focus on what Memorial Day means. It is not about beaches, picnics, or auto races. It is a day to remember. It is a day for us to remember the promise President Lincoln made to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. Freedom is not free. It's worth noting that our nation was at war 230 years ago as the American Revolution ended in 1783. And it was 200 years ago when our soldiers were dying on the battlefield in the War of 1812. It was 150 years ago in 1863, after the greatest battle ever fought on American soil, that Lincoln uttered the words of the Gettysburg Address as our nation dedicated, quote, a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives so our nation might live. 70 years ago, more Americans were dying in World War II. In 1953, we ended the Korean War. In 1973, we ended the Vietnam War, and perhaps next year, we will end the fighting in Afghanistan. Wars are not without their glory. They are not without heroes, but they bring such wretched loss of loved ones. Lincoln questioned that loss as a man who knew loss when he said at Gettysburg, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain." Our nation is richly populated in cemeteries for our veterans. In private cemeteries, both large and small, and no matter how remote, are the stones and markers on the last resting places of the men and women who Lincoln called these honored dead. Further, he said it was the job of the living to take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure. Therein lies the key to the underlying reason to honor our nation's war dead. We here, living today, have them to thank. The saying that they gave all their tomorrows so that we could have our todays is certainly most true on Memorial Day. Lincoln knew even more the heavy burden of that responsibility. At Gettysburg, he said that, quote, "We can never forget what they did here." Lincoln went on to say, "It is the living who must complete the promise of the founding principles of our nation." Freedom is not free. Scripture tells us that there is no greater love than that of a man laying down his life for his friends. The men and women that we honor and remember today have proven that they are not just friends to us as Americans, but they are friends to men and women in countries around the world. One such man, Sergeant William Stacy, epitomized what it meant to be a non-commissioned officer in the United States Marine Corps. He was described by a journalist embedded in Afghanistan as having, quote, "a bright and concentrated flame within him that could cut through stone. It spelled death and failure for his enemies and gave life to his comrades." On January 23rd last year, the 23-year-old from Redding, California, already on his 4th deployment to Afghanistan, was killed by an IED blast while walking patrol in Helmand Province. Like many going into combat, Sergeant Stacy wrote a letter to be read in the event that he would give his life. Quote, "My death did not change the world. It may be tough for you to justify its meaning at all, but there is a greater meaning to it. Perhaps I did not change the world, but there will be a child who will live because men left the security they enjoyed in their home country to come to his. And this child will learn in the new schools that they have built. He will walk his streets not worried about whether or not his leaders, henchmen are going to come and kidnap him. He will grow into a fine man who will pursue every opportunity his heart could desire. He will have the gift of freedom, which I have enjoyed for so long. If my life buys the safety of a child who will one day change this world, then I know that it was worth it. Freedom is not free. Ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that the sacrifice made by Sergeant Stacy and countless other American heroes has indeed changed the world. There is a simplistic and naive belief that war doesn't solve anything. I suppose that's true, unless you count winning America's independence, the preservation of the Union, the elimination of slavery, and the toppling of fascist, imperialist, and terrorist regimes. 60 years ago, America was engaged in a horrific war on the Korean Peninsula. Many died there, so today, many can live. 87-year-old Herbert Miller survived combat in World War II, but would not be alive today if not for the actions of Captain Emil Capon, who encountered Miller as he lay in a frozen and blood-drenched ditch in North Korea. Suffering from a grenade wound and a broken ankle and now captured by the Chinese, Miller was lifted and carried by Father Capon, a Catholic chaplain, who selflessly put the needs of his fellow soldiers ahead of his own. When Miller protested